The axe stops mid-swing. Somewhere behind him, hoofbeats. 3 sets, maybe 4, moving slow through the trees the way men move when they already believe they've won. He doesn't turn around yet. 8 years he buried a name in these mountains. 8 years of snow deep enough to swallow a man whole, and it still wasn't deep enough. A door closes inside the cabin. A woman's breath catches. Somewhere down that trail rides a man who has waited a long time for this morning, patient as rust, certain the law is finally on his side. The axe lowers. Slow. Whatever happens next won't be settled in these woods. Snow does not announce itself in the Bitterroot Mountains. It arrives the way ruin arrives, without the courtesy of a warning, settling into a person's plans the same patient way it settles into the seams of a coat. Margaret Donovan had learned that lesson once already, the day they carried Edward's body up from the mine shaft, his hands still curled into the shape they'd held around a pickaxe even in death. She was learning it again now. 3 days into a mountain crossing the territorial maps called passable, and the wind called a lie. She had been a fool to attempt this so late in the season, and she knew it the way a person only ever knows the truth of a wound, which is after the bleeding has already started. Stone Hollow sat 2 years behind her, and somewhere past these peaks waited a settlement where nobody would tilt their head at the sight of her and think the widow Donovan, where nobody had watched the mountain swallow her husband whole, and decided that made her a subject worth pitying over supper. She had sold everything to make this crossing. The house Edward built with his own hands the summer they married, the chickens, the narrow bed where she had memorized 5 years of his breathing before a collapsed shaft took it from her permanently. She had sold his tools last of all, because his hands seemed to live inside the worn grooves where his palms had pressed 1,000 times. And letting them go felt like erasing the final proof he had ever existed at all. Now her wagon sat tilted at an angle no wagon should sit at, one wheel buried to its hub, the axle cracked clean through with a sound she still heard whenever the wind dropped low enough to let the memory back in. Her horse stood with its head bowed, snow gathering along its spine in a way that made the animal look like something already turning to stone. And Margaret sat wrapped in every blanket she owned, doing the arithmetic of her own death with the flat, practical calm the frontier had carved into her over 2 long years. No one knew where she was. The trading post still sat 2 days off in fair weather, and this weather had stopped pretending to be fair somewhere around midnight. She had bread, dried meat, a little flour. She had no way to start a fire in wind that stole the breath out of a person's mouth before it could warm anything. The cold would finish her long before hunger ever got the chance. She found Edward's pocket watch in the lining of her coat, the one object she had refused to sell no matter the price offered. The metal had gone the temperature of river ice against her palm. She opened the case, but the dark inside the wagon swallowed the photograph whole, and she sat there holding a picture she couldn't see, reconstructing the shape of a dead man's face entirely from memory. "I'm sorry," she said to the dark. "I tried." She must have drifted because she didn't hear him approach. One moment there was only wind and the creak of straining canvas. The next there was a shape outside the wagon, enormous, wrong in scale. The kind of silhouette that shouldn't belong to anything human until it knocked against the wagon's side with a fist that sounded like it could have split the wood without trying. Her hand found the knife in her coat pocket before her mind had finished deciding to be afraid. Anyone alive in there? The voice came rough, low in a register that seemed to rise out of the ground rather than a chest. Margaret didn't answer immediately. Couldn't. Her throat had locked itself around the question of whether this was death finally arriving in a shape that could speak, or something worse than death entirely. "Who's there?" she managed. "Someone as half-frozen as you, I'd wager." A pause, the wind filling the silence where his next words should have landed. "Saw your wagon from the ridge. Didn't expect to find anybody still breathing down here." She pushed the canvas flap aside with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking and looked out into the storm. And what she saw made her grip tighten on the knife handle until her knuckles ached. He was tall in a way that rearranged her understanding of the word. Tall enough that she found herself wondering absurdly whether every doorway he'd ever passed through in his life had required some small daily negotiation with his own height. He stood broad through the shoulders and chest, wrapped in heavy cowhide with a wolf pelt thrown across it like a second skin, his face mostly lost behind a beard gone dark with melted snow and a hat brim crusted white. He looked less like a man who had walked through the blizzard, and more like something the blizzard had assembled out of whatever spare parts it found lying around. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, and something underneath the roughness of his voice made the words land as fact rather than reassurance. "You lost too?" "No, ma'am. I know these mountains." He gestured with one massive arm toward the wagon, the motion somehow gentle despite the size of the limb performing it. "But I need shelter from this wind, and you've got the only cover for a mile in any direction. I'm asking permission to wait it out. I'll keep to my side. Come morning, if we're both still drawing breath, I'll help you with that axle." She studied him. This stranger materialized out of nothing, out of weather that should have killed anything caught moving through it. Every instinct that had kept her alive these past 2 years told her to refuse, to protect what little remained rather than gamble it on a man's word in the dark. But Edward used to say she had a soft heart, said it the way other husbands complained about their wives, half exasperated and wholly in love, and maybe that explained why what came out of her mouth was nothing like what her instincts were screaming. "All right, but I've got a knife. Fair enough." He climbed in slow, his size making the simple act of entering a wagon look like a feat of engineering, and he kept to the far side exactly as he'd promised. In the cramped dark, she studied him properly now. Older than she'd first guessed, somewhere past 40, grey threading through the brown of his beard the way frost finds its way into a window crack. His eyes, when the dim light caught them, were cautious without being cruel. The eyes of a man who had been cold for far longer than one storm could account for. Her fingers refused to stop trembling, and she tucked them beneath her arms, chasing a warmth that wasn't there. He noticed, of course he noticed. A man his size noticed everything in a space that small, and he shrugged out of his coat, the wolf pelt still attached, holding it toward her without ceremony. "I can't take your coat," she said. "I've got layers." "You're shaking hard enough to rattle the wagon boards." When she hesitated, his jaw tightened, something old moving behind his eyes. "Please. A woman froze to death once because of me. I don't aim to repeat that." The weight inside those words stopped her protest cold. She took the coat. It smelled of wood smoke and pine sap and something underneath she couldn't name, and it was warm in a way that felt almost indecent given the temperature outside. "Thank you," she said, and he only nodded, already turning his attention to the practical matter of supplies, professional, retreating into usefulness, because feeling things had become a luxury the night couldn't afford. "You got food?" he asked. "A little. We should eat. Keep our strength." She broke the bread in half and offered him the larger piece, and he stared at it a beat too long before accepting it, the way a man accepts something he's decided he doesn't deserve. They ate without speaking, the wind doing all the talking for them, and when she passed the canteen, he drank only a little before handing it back, rationing even his thirst. "What's your name?" she asked finally. "Caleb." "Caleb Strode. I'm Margaret Donovan. Where were you headed?" "Mrs. Donovan West. The new settlement past the ridge." She paused, an old reflex correcting itself. "It's just Donovan now. I'm a widow. I'm sorry for your loss." Still words, but they carried an understanding too specific to be polite formula. And she found herself studying him in the dark, the way a person studies a locked door they suspect leads somewhere important. "You've lost someone too," she said, not a question. He didn't answer it like one. "We should rest. Storm might break by morning." They settled into separate corners, and Margaret kept the knife close through the first hour, but then the second. But as the night wore on and Caleb Strode did nothing but breathe slow, and even on his side of the wagon, her grip on the handle loosened without her permission. The wind howled. The wagon groaned beneath accumulating snow, and inside that small enclosed dark, something that wasn't quite warmth but resembled its shadow began, impossibly, to exist between two strangers who had every reason not to trust each other. Just before sleep finally pulled her under, she heard him murmur, so quiet she nearly mistook it for wind, "Thank you for the bread." When she woke, he was gone, and the storm had broken into a silence so complete, it felt like its own kind of violence. For one terrible heartbeat, she believed she'd dreamed the entire encounter, conjured a giant out of desperation and cold, and the particular madness of nearly dying alone in a mountain pass. Then she pushed aside the canvas and saw him, 50 yards off in a clearing, axe already swinging, and understood that whatever had happened in that wagon overnight was only the opening line of something considerably longer. The morning came on crystalline and merciless. the kind of light that follows catastrophe and dares the world to call itself beautiful anyway. Margaret stood in the wagon's tilted doorway, blinking against the brightness, trying to make her mind accept what her eyes kept insisting was true. Caleb Strode stood in the clearing, and he had clearly not slept. 2 pines already lay felled and stripped of their branches in rough parallel lines, and he was working a third, the axe rising and falling with a rhythm that belonged to years of practice rather than a single desperate night. Each swing connected with a crack that traveled across the frozen valley like distant thunder. He set his feet wide to manage the swing's full arc, his enormous frame committing to each strike the way other men commit to a single decision that changes everything afterward. She pulled on her boots, his coat still wrapped around her shoulders, and made her way toward him through snow that came past her knees. Her legs didn't want to obey, the cold burned going down into her lungs, but she pushed forward anyway, because the alternative was standing still and trying to reason through a man building something out of nothing. And her mind needed motion more than it needed answers. Caleb saw her coming and set the axe head against his shoulder, and up close in full daylight she could read the exhaustion carved into his face. He hadn't slept at all. His breath came out in heavy white clouds and sweat had soaked through his shirt despite air cold enough to crack stone. "What are you doing?" she asked. He looked at her a long beat, then gestured at the clearing with the kind of economy that suggested every gesture cost him something. "Building you a cabin." The words landed so flatly she assumed she'd misheard them. "A cabin? Yes, ma'am." "I don't understand." He set the axe down and crossed to the logs already arranged, where he'd marked a foundation directly into the snow, a rectangle roughly 20 feet by 15. The corner logs sat ready for notching, ready for stacking, the first skeleton of something that intended to outlast both of them. "You saved my life last night," he said, not looking at her, his attention fixed on the rope he was using to measure. "You gave me shelter when you had every reason to turn me away. Shared your food when you barely had enough for yourself. I pay my debts. You don't owe me a cabin." "I know then why." He stopped, turned to face her fully, and in the morning light his eyes were a deep brown that held a sadness with no visible bottom to it. "Because 8 years ago my wife and my daughter got caught in a winter storm trying to reach the next town. Their wagon broke an axle, same as yours. No one came, no one stopped to help. By the time I found them, they'd been gone 2 days. The words dropped between them and sat there, heavy as the logs at his feet. Margaret felt her throat close around a grief that wasn't even hers. "I'm sorry," she said, "so am I." He picked the rope back up, but his hands weren't quite steady now, the precision gone for one unguarded moment. "I've spent 8 years in these mountains, Mrs. Donovan, alone, hiding from people, from memory, from everything that might ask something of me again." He moved to the next log. "Last night, when I saw your wagon through the storm, I thought about walking past. Thought about leaving you to whatever the mountain decided, because getting tangled up with people again meant feeling things I'd worked hard to stop feeling. But I couldn't do it. And when you let me in, when you handed me bread you couldn't spare and treated me like a man, instead of whatever I've become out here, something in me remembered what being alive used to feel like." He met her eyes again, his voice rough with something he wasn't bothering to hide anymore. "You're alive because you're strong and because you're kind. You don't deserve to die in a broken wagon. You deserve a home. So I'm building you one. It's not charity. It's not pity. It's gratitude, and it's the only thing I know how to give." Tears froze on her cheeks before she even registered she was crying. "I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything." He paused. "But if you want to help, I could use another set of hands. I don't know how to build a cabin. I do. I'll teach you." And so it began. He showed her how to strip bark with a draw knife, how to notch the log ends so they'd lock together without nails, how to judge which trees grew straight enough to bear weight. The work split her palms open within the first hour, raw and unfamiliar after 2 years of grief that had taught her how to survive and nothing more. But there was a satisfaction in it that surprised her, the visible proof of progress, the sense of building something real instead of simply enduring another day until it ended. Caleb taught without condescension. He demonstrated, watched her attempt it, corrected without criticizing. And there was something in his patience that suggested he needed this work as much as she needed the shelter it would eventually provide. They worked through the morning and afternoon, stopping only to eat dried meat from her dwindling supplies, and by the time shadows began stretching long across the snow, 4 logs sat notched and positioned, the first true corners of something that hadn't existed 12 hours earlier. "It's real," she said quietly, looking at what they'd made. "Yes, ma'am." "How long will it take, if the weather holds?" he considered. "A good while yet, built faster when I had to, back when I was a soldier. We threw up shelters wherever the army sent us." He paused, something closing behind his eyes. That was a long time ago. There was a story buried in that pause. She could tell, but she didn't reach for it. Not yet. They had time, if what he said about the building held true, time enough to learn the shapes of each other's histories one careful layer at a time. That evening they made camp near the broken wagon, and Caleb built a fire with the same economy he brought to everything, and they sat on opposite sides of it, eating beans heated in a battered tin pot. Firelight carved shadows across the sharp planes of his face, caught the gray threaded through his beard, made the size of him seem somehow less like a wall and more like a mountain that had decided temporarily to sit still. "Why'd you leave the army?" she asked. He was quiet long enough that she thought the question had gone unanswered. Then flat, "Because 8 years ago I killed a man I wasn't supposed to kill. The same year I lost my wife and daughter, and I ran before they could hang me for it." Her breath caught hard in her chest. The same year, same season, near enough. He stared into the fire rather than at her, lost everything inside about 4 months. The army doesn't slow down to let a man grieve proper. Doesn't care what a man's just buried when it hands him his next set of orders. "You're a wanted man. I expect I still am, though it's been 8 years and no one's come looking. Most folks figure Caleb Strode died in these mountains a long time back." He looked across the fire at her. "If that changes your mind about the cabin, I understand. I can be gone before morning." She thought about it. Thought about the gentleness in his enormous hands when he'd guided hers along the drawknife. Thought about the coat he'd given her without hesitation, the grief in his voice when he spoke of a wife and daughter she would never meet. "No," she said finally. "Don't go. Whatever you did, whoever you were back then, that's not the man I met last night. The man I met was kind, honorable. That's who I'm choosing to trust." He looked down at his hands, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped to something barely audible over the crackles of fire. "Thank you." They sat in a silence that had stopped being uncomfortable somewhere in the last hour, the silence of 2 people who had found something neither expected in each other. Not romance, not yet. Just the bare suggestion of its possibility, the idea that broken things might still, somehow be made whole. When Margaret finally climbed back into the wagon to sleep, she glanced back and saw him still seated by the fire, staring into the flames with something cradled in his lap she hadn't noticed before. His axe. He ran his thumb along the worn handle with an absent kind of affection, the way a person touches an old friend. And she understood then that the axe wasn't simply a tool to him. It was the thing that had kept him alive these 8 years, kept him useful, kept some thread of his humanity stitched together through isolation that would have unraveled most men entirely. And now he was using it to build her a home. As sleep finally pulled her under, wrapped in his coat that still smelled of wood smoke and pine, Margaret realized she hadn't thought about Edward's watch once that entire day. It still sat in her pocket, cold and heavy against her ribs, but for the first time in 2 years it didn't feel like the only thing tethering her to the world. There was something else now, something being built 1 log at a time in a clearing beside her ruined wagon, something that looked impossibly like a future. By the 3rd day the walls had risen to waist height, and a rhythm had settled between them like something earned rather than accidental. Caleb woke before dawn to work in the stillest cold, his breath fogging the dark, and Margaret rose with the sun to make breakfast, oatmeal when the supplies allowed it, beans when they didn't, before joining him at the site. They worked mostly without words now. The kind of quiet that comes when shared purpose makes conversation unnecessary. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, hauling a particularly heavy log into position, her boot slid across a patch of ice she hadn't seen, and she went backward, arms windmilling for balance that wasn't coming. Caleb's hand closed around her arm before she'd even finished falling, and for one suspended moment they stood close enough that she could see flecks of gold scattered through the brown of his eyes, close enough to catch the pine sap on his clothes beneath the wood smoke, close enough to feel heat radiating off a body that size despite the brutal cold around them. "Careful," he said, his voice gone rough. "Thank you." He let go immediately, stepped back, put careful distance between them like a man retreating from a fire he'd gotten too close to. Ice is dangerous, should have cleared it sooner, but they both understood that ice wasn't what had made the moment dangerous. That evening, over the same sparse dinner of beans and the last of the dried meat, Margaret found herself watching him more carefully than she had allowed herself to before. The certainty in his hands when he worked, the way he listened fully when she spoke, as if her words carried weight worth carrying, the way his face sometimes settled into an expression of loneliness so profound it hurt to witness. "Tell me about your wife," she said softly. He looked up, surprised. "Why?" "Because you loved her, and because grief carried alone gets heavier, not lighter." He was quiet for a long stretch, long enough that she thought he'd refuse outright. "Then her name was Ruth. We met when I was stationed out near the fort after the war ended. She was a schoolteacher's daughter, educated, probably too good for a soldier with nothing much to offer. But she said yes when I asked anyway. We had 7 good years. You had a daughter, Abigail." He stopped. Swallowed something hard. She was 5 when. He stopped again, started over. "She had Ruth's eyes, green as new grass in spring. Used to follow me everywhere, asking questions about everything under the sun. Why's the sky blue? Where do birds go when it's winter? What makes thunder?" A ghost of a smile crossed his face and vanished just as fast. I didn't know the answers to half of what she asked. But I tried. Margaret felt her own eyes start to burn. "What happened to them?" "I was escorting a supply wagon to the next post. 3 days. Supposed to be. Ruth decided to visit her sister while I was gone. Weather turned. Their wagon broke down on the road." His voice flattened out, the particular emptiness of feeling too large to be spoken plainly. "I found them 4 days later, frozen together, trying to keep each other warm. Caleb, the worst part," he continued, as though he hadn't heard her say his name at all, "is they were 2 miles from help. 2 miles. If anybody had ridden that road, if anyone at all had seen them, they'd have lived. But nobody came. Nobody stopped. It wasn't your fault. I know that. In my head, I know it." He poked at the fire, sparks spiraling up into the dark, but knowing a thing and believing it aren't the same animal at all. She pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders. 8 years is a long time to carry that alone, felt appropriate. "Punishment for failing them. Ruth wouldn't have wanted that for you." "No," he admitted. "She'd have told me I was being a fool. Stubborn past reason, which I am." He looked at her across the flames, something unguarded slipping through. But it was easier to stay alone than risk caring about somebody again. And failing them too, the words hung there, heavy with everything he wasn't saying outright, and Margaret understood the real shape of his confession. That building this cabin frightened him. That being here with her frightened him. That every plank they raised together was a small act of defiance against the walls he'd spent 8 years constructing around whatever remained of his heart. She wanted to tell him she understood, that she felt the same fear clawing at her ribs every time she caught herself watching the line of his jaw in firelight instead of thinking of Edward. That the guilt of even noticing him felt like its own kind of betrayal. But before she found the words, Caleb stood abruptly. "We're running low on supplies," he said, his tone gone deliberately practical. "I should make a trip into Stone Hollow, get nails, more rope, glass for windows if they've got it. How far?" "Half a day's walk. I'll leave at first light. Be back by evening." A sharp fear bloomed in her chest at the thought of being alone in this clearing again. "Will you?" She stopped, hating the need audible in her own voice. "Will you come back?" He looked at her, and something in his expression softened past the careful distance he'd been holding all evening. "Yes, Mrs. Donovan. I'll come back. I don't break promises, and I promise to finish your cabin." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in the wagon listening to wind moving through the pines, thinking of Caleb alone by the dying fire a few yards off, thinking of Ruth and Abigail frozen together in a wagon not unlike her own, thinking of Edward, crushed in the dark of a collapsed shaft. She thought of all the ways the world found to take people from each other, and then she reached for the leather portfolio at the bottom of her trunk, the one holding her mother's recipes, untouched since she'd left Stone Hollow because the handwriting inside felt too much like a ghost speaking directly to her. If Caleb was riding to town tomorrow, she could send him with a list. Real ingredients. Something to cook that wasn't simple survival. A way to give back that wasn't just standing beside him while he built. The thought settled something in her chest. Made her feel less like a burden carried and more like a partner carrying her share. When dawn broke and Caleb prepared to leave, She met him outside the wagon with a short list written in careful script: flour, salt, sugar if the store had any, dried herbs. She handed it over with coins from her thinning purse. For supper, she explained. When you're back, he studied the list, then her, something warm moving behind his eyes. You don't have to do this, I know, but you didn't have to build me a cabin either, and here we are. He smiled then, and it transformed his whole face. Stripped years off it, made him look briefly like a man who had never spent a single night alone in these mountains. Here we are, he agreed. She watched him walk into the trees, following a trail only he seemed able to read, until the forest swallowed him whole. Then she turned back to the half-finished cabin and understood fully that she was alone again, truly alone for the first time since the storm. But the solitude felt different now. Not abandonment, just absence, and absence carried within it the promise of return. She spent the day working what she could manage by herself, clearing debris, organizing the few tools they had, sweeping accumulated snow off the foundation. The walls stood solid around her, proof of what Caleb's hands had already accomplished. She ran her palm along the logs, feeling where his axe had smoothed and shaped each one, where every joint fit with a precision that spoke of care rather than mere necessity. Stone Hollow sat low in a valley that smelled of wood smoke and horse, and the particular sourness of a town too small to properly drain its mud. Caleb kept his hat brim low walking the main street, not from habit exactly. More from 8 years of instinct that had never quite worn off, no matter how far he'd buried himself in the mountains. He'd nearly finished loading nails and a small crate of window glass onto a borrowed pack horse when a voice behind him made his spine go rigid before his mind had even processed the words. Strode, he turned slow. The man standing there was lean, well-dressed in a way that didn't belong to ranch work or mining, his coat cut sharper than anything Stone Hollow's general store could have supplied. His eyes had a particular cold clarity to them, the kind that comes from a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You've got the wrong name, friend," Caleb said, keeping his voice even. "I don't think I do." The man stepped closer, unhurried, the crowd on the boardwalk parting around him without seeming to notice they were doing it. "I'd know that scar on your wrist anywhere. Heard about it from someone who watched you get it. Right before you put a bullet in my brother's chest." Caleb's whole body went very still. "Webb, you remember the name," the man said, something satisfied moving across his face. "Good. Makes this easier. I'm Nathaniel. Victor was my brother." He paused, letting that settle. "I've spent 8 years wondering if you really were dead in these mountains the way everybody assumed. Imagine my surprise. What do you want?" "What I've wanted since the day they buried him with half his face missing." Nathaniel's voice stayed almost pleasant, which made it worse. "I'm not going to let this lie quiet, Strode. My brother's dead, and you're the reason. And I intend to make sure the law remembers that fact whether the army's forgotten or not." Caleb didn't flinch. "Your brother was selling army rifles to men who used them to kill soldiers under my command. If the law wants the truth, that's where they should start digging." Nathaniel's smile thinned. "Convenient story. 8 years old and only one man left alive to tell it. There's witnesses. Dead men tell better stories than living ones, in my experience. Easier to control." Nathaniel stepped back, adjusting his coat with the unhurried calm of a man who already believed he'd won. "I'll be paying close attention to wherever you end up next, Captain. Wherever that is, you can count on it." He turned and walked off down the boardwalk without waiting for a response, and Caleb stood there with the pack horse's lead rope cutting into his palm, his pulse hammering hard enough that he could feel it behind his eyes. He finished loading the supplies with hands that wanted to shake and didn't let them, and he rode back toward the cabin with the weight of that conversation sitting on his chest like a stone he couldn't set down. By the time the sun began sinking and shadows stretched longs across the snow, Margaret found herself watching the tree line, waiting. And when she finally saw him emerge, a pack slung over one massive shoulder, something bloomed in her chest she hadn't felt in 2 years. Relief. Plain, uncomplicated joy at the simple fact of someone returning. He raised a hand in greeting. She waved back, and neither of them acknowledged out loud that the moment meant more than it should have, that something between them had shifted in the hours apart. "How was town?" she asked once he'd set down the pack. "Fine." "You're not fine." "I'm tired." She let it go, because pushing felt like it might break something neither of them was ready to have broken. But over supper that evening, watching him stir beans he wasn't eating, watching his eyes drift again and again toward the dark beyond the firelight. She understood that whatever he was carrying had gotten heavier somewhere between the cabin and Stone Hollow. He had come back exactly as promised, and Margaret realized with something like wonder that she had never once doubted he would. What she hadn't expected was the silence riding back in with him, sitting now at the edge of their fire like an uninvited third guest. The cabin grew over the following days the way something grows rather than the way something is built, organic, inevitable. The walls climbed past shoulder height, then above their heads entirely, until they stood enclosed by logs solid enough to break the wind and trap the warmth of their evening fire. Caleb framed the spaces where windows and a door would eventually sit, measuring everything twice before a single cut, his movements unhurried even when his hands betrayed the urgency underneath. They'd developed a private language of nods and small gestures by now, comfortable enough with each other that words had become almost optional, but certain things remained unspoken between them. Important things, the kind that sat heavy in a chest and refused to be named out loud. On the sixth day, lifting a roof beam into position together, their hands brushed and then tangled around the rough wood without either of them deciding to let that happen. The beam settled into place, secured, and still neither of them released their grip. Caleb looked down at their joined hands, at the way her smaller fingers fit between his, and something in his expression went unguarded in a way it hadn't before. "Margaret," he said, quiet. She looked up and saw her own confusion and longing reflected directly back at her in his eyes. "I should go," he said. "When the cabin's finished, I should go. Why? Because staying is dangerous. For both of us, dangerous how?" He released her hand, stepped back, ran a hand through his hair in open frustration. "Because I'm starting to feel things I've got no right feeling. Because every day I stay, it gets harder to imagine the leaving. Because you deserve better than a man running from his own past." "You don't get to decide what I deserve," Margaret said, her voice steady even with everything churning underneath it. "I'm a grown woman who survived the worst loss of her life. I think I can decide for myself what's good for me. Can you say the same?" He turned to face her fully. "What I see is a woman still wearing her wedding ring, still carrying her husband's watch, still deep enough in grief that she tried to die in a blizzard sooner than face another day alone. I won't be a substitute for what you lost, Margaret. I won't be the convenient man who happened to be there when you were at your most vulnerable." The words landed harder than he'd clearly intended, and she saw them strike home, saw her own face flush with a fury that surprised even her. "How dare you," she said, low and sharp. "How dare you decide what I feel or what I need? Yes, I love Edward. Yes, I still grieve him every single day. But that doesn't mean I've gone incapable of moving forward. It doesn't mean what I feel looking at you is only loneliness, wearing a different coat. Then what is it? I don't know yet." The admission tore out of her like a confession she hadn't meant to give. "I don't know what this is between us because it's too new and too frightening and moving too fast. But I know it's real, Caleb. I know that when you left for town, I spent the whole day waiting on you to come back. I know when you look at me, I feel seen in a way I haven't felt in 2 years. I know you make me want to be alive again instead of just surviving the days as they come." Caleb stared at her, his pulse visibly hammering at his throat. "Margaret, and maybe you're right," she pushed on, tears tracking down her face now. "Maybe I'm not ready. Maybe you aren't either. Maybe we're both too broken to build anything real out of this. But you don't get to make that choice for me. You don't get to decide I'm better off alone." The silence that followed held nothing but wind through the pines and their own uneven breathing. Caleb wanted badly to close the distance between them, to pull her in and promise everything would turn out fine. But he had learned the hard way that promises did nothing to protect people from the world's particular cruelties. "I killed a man, Margaret," he said finally, his voice flat with the weight of finally saying it plain. "His name was Colonel Victor Webb. I put a bullet through his chest 8 years ago. The same season I buried my wife's daughter. I told you it was a long time back. I never told you it was the same year, because saying it out loud makes it sound like the universe was trying to finish me off entirely. And some days I think it nearly did." She went still. Her tears dried where they sat on her cheeks as she listened. "He was my commanding officer at the fort after the fighting ended. I thought the war was behind me, thought I could finally settle in with Ruth and Abigail and just live. Found out he was running army rifles to hostile bands. selling government weapons for profit while good men died because of guns he'd put in the wrong hands. I found proof, confronted him, told him I'd report him to Territorial Command. His voice went distant, narrating someone else's life. He pulled his pistol first, said I was a liar, a traitor, that no commander would ever believe a broken-down captain over a decorated colonel. He was probably right, but I was faster. I shot him before he could shoot me, and then I ran, because I knew the truth wasn't going to matter to anybody wearing a badge. But that's self-defense, Margaret said. You were protecting yourself, exposing corruption. The army doesn't deal in nuance, Margaret. They deal in order and chain of command, eh? I killed a superior officer 4 months after I buried my family. He stopped like the next part cost something to say. I wasn't right in the head by then, I know that now. A man thinking clear doesn't walk into a warehouse alone to confront a colonel with friends in Washington. But I wasn't thinking clear. I was just done losing things quiet. So I ran, and I've been running about 8 years now, give or take. And today his brother found me standing in the middle of Stone Hollow's Main Street like he'd been waiting the whole time for the privilege. Margaret's breath caught audibly. His brother is here, Nathaniel Webb. Found me at the general store. Caleb met her eyes across the fire, says he's not letting this rest. Says he'll be watching for wherever I turn up next. She crossed the space between them without deciding to, knelt beside his chair, took both his enormous hands in hers. You won't face it alone. Whatever this man wants to bring down on you, I'm not going anywhere. You don't know that yet. I'm telling you that, she said, voice steady despite everything trembling underneath it. He looked down at their joined hands. Hers swallowed entirely inside his, and something in him finally cracked open in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with relief. The following days carried a different texture entirely. Every sound from the tree line made Margaret's pulse spike. Every distant bark of a dog sent her hand reaching instinctively for Edward's old rifle propped now by the cabin door. Caleb worked faster than ever. The roof finished, the door hung, the window glass set carefully into its frame, as though finishing the structure might somehow finish the danger circling it too. On the 8th evening, with the cabin essentially livable for the first time, they stood together in the doorway looking out at what they'd built. 4 walls, a roof that didn't leak, a door that closed against the wind. It's really yours now, Caleb said. Ours, she corrected, the way she had once before. Except this time the word came out steadier, more certain, like something she'd decided rather than something that had simply slipped free. He turned to look at her, and the look on his face made her chest go tight in an entirely different way than fear did. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. Loving somebody, risking somebody. Last time I tried it cost me everything inside 4 months. I know, I might cost you everything too. If Nathaniel Webb gets his way, Margaret reached up, pressed her palm flat against his chest, felt his heart hammering beneath layers of wool and hide. Then we face that together, same as everything else. He bent down, slow, giving her every chance to step back, and when she didn't, he kissed her with a careful gentleness that seemed almost impossible coming from hands large enough to fell a tree in a dozen strokes. It wasn't the kiss of 2 people falling carelessly into something new. It was the kiss of 2 people who understood exactly what they were risking and chose to risk it anyway. That night, lying in the cabin's first proper bed, a frame Caleb had built from salvaged wagon wood, Margaret listened to him, breathing slow and even beside her, and thought about everything that had brought them to this point. A storm that should have killed her. A man the storm had delivered instead. A debt repaid in logs and nails and 8 years of buried grief, finally spoken aloud in a single unbroken night. She didn't know yet that the next morning would carry the sound of hoofbeats through the trees. 3 sets at least, moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace of men who already believed they had nothing left to rush toward. That sound was still hours away. For now there was only the fire burning down to embers, the new walls holding the cold outside where it belonged, and the steady rhythm of a man's heartbeat under her palm, the first sound in 2 years that had managed to drown out the echo of a mine shaft collapsing somewhere underground. The hoofbeats arrived exactly as Caleb had feared they would, 3 sets moving through the trees with the deliberate pace of men in no particular hurry, because men hunting something already cornered rarely needed to rush. He heard them before Margaret did, his body going rigid with an alertness that had never fully left him no matter how many years he'd buried it under axe work and solitude. Margaret, he called, voice carefully controlled. Company. She came to his side at the window, wrapped in a blanket, hair loose around her shoulders, and went pale at what she saw through the new glass. 3 men on horseback, one wearing a badge that caught the early light, and behind them, hanging back at a deliberate distance, a 4th rider in a coat too fine for mountain travel. Webb, Caleb said quietly. Nathaniel Webb brought the law with him. The riders drew rein perhaps 20 yards out, and the man wearing the badge studied the cabin with the careful, practiced eye of someone who had done this exact thing more times than he probably wanted to count. Older, weathered, somewhere past 50, with the kind of face that had learned not to show much of anything. Morning, he called out. Looking for a man named Caleb Strode. Caleb stepped through the door alone, putting himself between the riders and the cabin, drawing every eye toward himself the way he'd learned to do years ago when there was a threat and someone behind him worth protecting. I'm Strode. The sheriff studied him a long moment. I'm Amos Pratt, sheriff out of Stone Hollow. These men with me are deputies. He paused, something almost apologetic crossing his weathered face. We need to have a conversation, Captain Strode. The use of his old rank landed like a physical blow. After 8 years, somehow, impossibly, it had finally caught up to him. Margaret pushed past Caleb before he could stop her, her voice sharp with a fury that surprised even her. What is this about? Sheriff Pratt's expression gentled slightly, looking at her. You'd be the widow Donovan. Word travels, even out here. He glanced at the cabin behind her. Fine work he's done for you. What is this about? She demanded again. Pratt's gaze returned to Caleb. I've got a warrant. Desertion from the United States Army. Murder of a superior officer. He pulled a folded paper from inside his coat, held it up without offering it closer. Warrant's 8 years old. Still good as the day it was signed. Behind the sheriff, Nathaniel Webb sat his horse with an expression of quiet, satisfied triumph that made Margaret's hands curl into fists at her sides. Caleb didn't murder anyone, she said, fierce and clear. He told me everything. It was self-defense against a corrupt officer. That may be true, ma'am, Pratt said, not unkindly. But that's a matter for a courtroom, not for me standing in the snow. My job's to bring him in. Let the territorial judge sort out the truth of it. I understand, Caleb said, his voice steady in a way that seemed to surprise the sheriff. Can I have a moment to gather what I need? One of the younger deputies shifted, hand drifting toward his holster. Pratt held up a hand without looking at him. Let him, he's not running. Are you, Strode? No, sir, I'm done running. The admission seemed to land harder on Margaret than on anyone else present. She grabbed his arm as he turned toward the cabin, her fingers digging in with a strength born entirely of desperation. You can't just surrender, she said, low and urgent. We'll fight this. We'll prove what really happened. I'm not giving up, he said, turning to face her fully, his enormous hands settling gently on her shoulders. But I can't run anymore, Margaret. I'm tired of hiding. If there's any chance at clearing my name, it starts with facing what I did instead of burying it in these mountains for another 8 years. They'll hang you. Maybe. He managed something that almost resembled a smile. But maybe they won't. You told me hope wasn't foolish. I'm choosing to believe that now. Pratt's voice carried over from where the riders waited, patient but not infinitely so. Strode. Time's up. Caleb pressed a kiss to her forehead, brief and aching, then stepped back and disappeared into the cabin, emerging a moment later with a pack far lighter than the one he'd carried into these mountains 8 years earlier. He'd left everything that mattered behind. His tools, his supplies. The carved door latch finished only days before. Walking toward the sheriff, he passed close enough to Nathaniel Webb to read the satisfaction written plain across the man's face, and something in Caleb's chest went cold and hard in a way it hadn't since the night he'd pulled a trigger 8 years ago. You got what you wanted, he said quietly, not stopping. For now, Nathaniel replied, voice pleasant as poison. We'll see how the rest plays out. Pratt gestured to one of his deputies, who dismounted and offered his horse without comment. Caleb mounted, his size making the animal look almost comically small beneath him, and allowed himself one last look back at the cabin, standing solid against the gray morning sky, Margaret framed in the doorway with her arms wrapped tight around herself, heartbreak written plain across every line of her face. Sheriff, she called suddenly, stepping forward. Pratt reined in. Ma'am, how long until there's a trial? Hard to say. Judge Hale rides circuit through 3 territories. Could be weeks before he's free to hear it. Then I'm coming with you. That's not necessary, ma'am. I'm a witness to his character, she said, chin lifting in the same defiance Caleb had come to recognize as entirely, permanently hers. And I'm not staying up here alone while he faces this down in town. So either I ride with you now, or I follow on foot behind you. Your choice which one looks better to whoever's watching. Pratt glanced at Caleb, who only shrugged, a gesture that somehow conveyed both helplessness and pride at once. She's stubborn, the sheriff observed. You have no idea, Caleb said. Pratt sighed, the particular sigh of a lawman who had learned, over many years, when a fight wasn't worth having. All right, Mrs. Donovan, pack what you need. But we ride in 10 minutes, and I won't slow my pace on your account. Margaret vanished back into the cabin and emerged minutes later with a small bundle, Edward's old rifle, and a leather portfolio she hadn't touched since leaving Stone Hollow the first time, the one holding her mother's recipes, now repurposed for an entirely different kind of testimony. What's that for? Caleb asked as she approached. Because I'm going to write down everything, she said, eyes blazing. Every conversation, every moment, from the night you found my wagon until this one. And I'm going to make certain that whoever sits in judgment of you hears all of it. Not just the worst 5 minutes of your life from 8 years ago. Something loosened in Caleb's chest, some fist of dread that had been clenched there since the hunters first rode through the clearing. He wasn't alone in this. Whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. One of the deputies brought a horse for Margaret, helping her mount with rough courtesy, and she settled into the saddle with the easy competence of a woman who had spent her whole life on this frontier, despite everything it had taken from her. They set out towards Stone Hollow with Caleb flanked by deputies and Margaret riding near the sheriff, Nathaniel Webb trailing at the rear with the unhurried satisfaction of a man who believed the outcome already settled. As they left the clearing, Caleb looked back one final time at the cabin. The walls stood solid and true. The windows held their new glass, catching the grey morning light. The door he'd hung himself opened onto a life that might never get the chance to be lived inside it. But it was there. It was real. He'd built something that might outlast him regardless of what happened next, and that mattered more than he could find words for. Pratt noticed him looking back. Good work, that. Best cabin I've seen go up in these mountains in a long while. It was supposed to be her home, Caleb said. Maybe it still will be. He didn't say anything else for a long stretch of the ride. The trail wound down through stands of lodgepole pine going grey with distance, the morning cold sharpening as the sun climbed without quite managing to warm anything. Margaret kept her eyes forward, refusing to look at Nathaniel Webb trailing behind them, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing how badly his presence rattled her. Partway down the trail, Pratt fell back to ride beside her, his weathered face unreadable in the flat morning light. You believe him, the sheriff said. Not a question exactly. Every word 8 years is a long time to carry a story without it changing shape some. Some men's stories change with time, Margaret said. Others get worn smoother, truer, the longer they're forced to live inside them. I know which kind Caleb's carrying. Pratt studied her a moment longer, something shifting behind his eyes that might have been the beginning of respect, or might only have been professional curiosity. Hope you're right, Mrs. Donovan, for both your sakes. Behind them, far enough back to seem almost casual, Nathaniel Webb rode with the patient confidence of a man who had waited 8 years and intended to enjoy whatever came next. Margaret didn't turn to look at him, but she felt his presence the entire ride down, a cold weight settling at the base of her spine, the certain knowledge that whatever justice waited in Stone Hollow, it wouldn't arrive easily and it wouldn't arrive without a fight. Stone Hollow's jail held 2 cells, both built for men of ordinary size, and Caleb had to duck his head and turn sideways just to fit through the door of the one Pratt locked him into. He sat on a cot too short for him, his knees nearly to his chest, and decided after the first hour that the discomfort was almost a relief. Something to focus on besides the sound of Nathaniel Webb's boots on the boardwalk outside, pacing back and forth like a man counting down to something he'd waited 8 years to collect. Margaret took a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Henrietta Voss, a woman whose sharp eyes missed nothing and whose opinions arrived without being asked for. By the second morning, Margaret had learned that Henrietta had buried 2 husbands and outlived a third who'd simply wandered off one spring and never come back, and somewhere in that recitation Margaret understood she'd found an ally, however unlikely. You're fighting for him, Henrietta said over breakfast. Not a question. I am town's already decided he's guilty. Nathaniel Webb's been buying drinks and telling stories since the day before you all rode in. Then I'll need to start telling some stories of my own. Henrietta studied her over the rim of a chipped coffee cup. You'll need more than stories, dear. You'll need proof that holds up when a judge starts pulling at the threads. Margaret spent that first full day walking Stone Hollow's single muddy street with her mother's leather portfolio tucked against her ribs, knocking on doors that didn't always open and asking questions that didn't always get answered. The general store owner, a broad man named Otis Granger, agreed to speak with her only after she'd bought enough flour and coffee to make the conversation feel earned rather than charitable. Strode, Granger said, leaning against his own counter, considering. Used to come through here regular years back, before he disappeared into the mountains. Always paid square. Never raised his voice at anybody, not even when some folks gave him grief for being a Yankee officer in a town that still remembered which side it bled for. Did you know his family saw them a time or two? He bought the girl peppermint sticks every visit, ribbons for his wife's hair. Granger's expression shifted, something almost sorrowful crossing it. Man like that doesn't forget how to love people just because the world goes and breaks his heart in half within the same season it takes everything else from him too. Did you ever hear anything about a Colonel Webb? Granger's face changed entirely, closing like a door slammed shut. That's a name folks around here learned not to say too loud while his brother's still drawing breath in this territory. But you heard things, heard plenty. Never anything anybody could prove, mind, but smoke generally means there's fire underneath it somewhere. Supplies going missing from the fort, rifles ending up places they had no business ending up. He shook his head slowly. Nobody ever pinned it on Webb directly. Connections like his don't get pinned easy. Would you testify to what you've told me? Granger hesitated long enough that Margaret thought she'd lost him entirely. Then, quiet, I'll testify to Strode's character. That much I'll swear to plain. The rest of it, I'd be guessing at things I never saw with my own eyes. And a courtroom's no place for guessing when a man's life sits on the other side of the scale. It was something. Not everything, but something. And Margaret left the store with his name added to the short list growing inside her portfolio, the ink still wet enough to smudge against her thumb. That evening she visited Caleb at the jail, Pratt allowing her a few minutes at the bars while he busied himself elsewhere with the particular tact of a man giving two people privacy he wasn't officially permitted to give. "How's the cell?" she asked, trying for lightness and missing it by a wide margin, built for somebody half my size. He shifted on the narrow cot, the iron frame groaning under him. "Suppose that's fitting punishment all on its own. Don't joke about this, got to joke about something." Margaret, otherwise the waiting eats a man alive from the inside out. She reached through the bars, found his hand, held it the way she might hold something she was afraid of losing through carelessness alone. "I talked to Otis Granger today. He'll testify to your character. That's a start. I need names, Caleb. Soldiers who served under you. Anyone who saw what happened that day or knew enough about Webb to back up your story." He was quiet a long moment, his enormous frame seeming to shrink in the dim cell light. "There were two men, Corporal Lang and a private named Briggs. Last I heard they'd mustered out, settled somewhere south of here working ranch land. Don't know if they're even still breathing, let alone willing to stand up in a courtroom against the Webb name. I'll find them, Margaret. What if this goes wrong?" His voice dropped lower, rougher. "I need you to promise you'll go back to the cabin regardless. Live there. Don't let this town or that man take it from you on top of everything else." "I'm not making that promise," she said, fierce. "Because this isn't going wrong. We won't let it." He looked at her through the bars with something that might have been hope, might have been grief wearing hope's clothing, and neither of them could quite tell the difference anymore. The next morning brought a stroke of fortune Margaret hadn't dared hope for. A retired army chaplain named Father Elias Crane lived on the edge of town, tending a garden buried under snow. And when she explained her purpose, he invited her inside with the unhurried welcome of a man who had been waiting a long time to tell a story he'd never gotten the chance to finish. "Caleb Strode," Crane said, settling into a worn chair, tea cooling between his weathered hands. "I wondered for years what became of him. After his family died and he vanished, I prayed he'd found some kind of peace out there. Strange thing about that man, the way it all came down on him at once. The funeral was barely finished, and the army still expected him standing post within the month. Like grief had a schedule it was supposed to keep to. He found the mountains, Margaret said, living alone in them for 8 years. That sounds like Strode. Crane's expression turned somber. He was one of the finest men I knew in 40 years, wearing a chaplain's collar. After he lost his wife and daughter, he could have turned bitter, angry at everything, including God. Instead, he went quiet, careful, like he was trying to protect the rest of the world from whatever had broken inside him. Tell me about Colonel Webb. Crane's face darkened in a way that aged him 10 years in a single breath. Webb was the kind of man who makes you question whether cruelty's something a person learns or something they're simply born carrying. Cruel to the men under him, took bribes without shame. I suspected him of far worse, and I went to the post commander twice with my concerns. Nothing ever came of it. Webb had connections, political ones, the kind that make a chaplain's word disappear like smoke in wind. Do you believe Caleb killed him in self-defense? I believe Caleb Strode would never murder a man in cold blood. Crane leaned forward, his voice gaining a conviction that hadn't been there a moment earlier. But I also believe he wouldn't hesitate to defend himself, or anyone else, against a man like Victor Webb. If Caleb killed him, it's because Webb forced the matter. Of that much I am entirely certain. And I'll add this, since you've asked plain. A man grieving that fresh, that raw, doesn't think like other men do. He confronted Webb when a steadier mind might have waited, gathered more proof, gone about it different. Grief makes a man reckless even when he's in the right. Will you testify to that, Father? I'm 81 years old, my dear, but if I have to crawl to that courthouse on my own 2 knees, I'll be there to say every word of it. Margaret left his small house with tears she didn't bother wiping away, the portfolio growing heavier with every name added to it. And for the first time since the riders had come through the clearing, something inside her chest loosened enough to let in a thin thread of actual hope. Meanwhile, Caleb spent his days in the cell writing, Pratt having supplied paper and a stub of pencil without comment. He wrote out everything he could remember from 8 years earlier, names of soldiers who'd served alongside him, dates of supply shipments that never reached their destinations, the location of a warehouse where Webb had stockpiled weapons meant for men who would use them against the very army that issued them. He wrote until his enormous hand cramped round the pencil, the careful block letters of a man more accustomed to an axe handle than a writing implement. On the 4th evening, Pratt brought news, settling into a chair just outside the cell with the relaxed posture of a man who'd decided, somewhere along the way, that he believed more than he was officially supposed to. Telegraph came through, Pratt said. Judge Hale will hear the case. Can't get here for 3 weeks, though. He's finishing up circuit through the Eastern District first, 3 weeks. Caleb let the number settle, neither comfort nor catastrophe, simply a fact to be endured. In the meantime, your Mrs. Donovan's building quite a case down there. Got half the town lined up to speak on your character. Father Crane's apparently leading something close to a crusade on your behalf. Pratt pulled his chair closer to the bars. Need to ask you something plain, Strode. Did you do it? Caleb met the sheriff's eyes without flinching. Yes. Put a bullet through his chest at 10 feet. He drew first. I was faster. I killed him. And then I ran because I knew the truth wasn't going to matter to anybody wearing the kind of insignia Webb wore. And I'll tell you something else nobody's asked me yet. I wasn't right that day. Buried my wife and girl not 4 months prior. A man thinking straight doesn't walk into a warehouse alone against a colonel. I walked in anyway because I'd already lost everything that mattered to losing, and dying didn't scare me the way it should have. Why wouldn't the truth matter? Because he was a colonel with a senator for an uncle, and connections running clear to Washington, and I was a broken-down captain whose family had just frozen to death 2 miles short of help. Because the army needed somebody to blame for a dead colonel, and a grieving man with nothing left to lose was about as convenient as blame gets. He gripped the bars, the iron creaking faintly under the pressure. But I'm done running, Sheriff. Whatever comes of this, I'm done. Pratt was quiet a long moment. For what it's worth, I believe you. Doesn't change the law, but it matters some, I'd think. It matters plenty, Caleb said. After Pratt left, Caleb returned to his writing, documenting not just the shooting now, but the 8 years that had followed it, the solitude, the slow erosion, and then the slower restoration of whatever passed for his humanity. The night a blizzard had delivered a half-frozen widow directly into the one clearing in 1,000 miles where someone might actually have stopped to help her. He wrote because the act of writing made the chaos in his skull into something he could finally hold still long enough to examine. On the 5th day, Margaret arrived at the jail with news that made his pulse jump even before she finished speaking. "I found them," she said, breathless. "Corporal Lang and Private Briggs, working a ranch about 20 miles south. I sent a rider with a letter explaining everything, and they wrote back within 2 days, and they're willing to testify. They remember the missing weapons. They remember Webb's cruelty. They remember you trying to stop it through every proper channel before anything else happened." Caleb's hands tightened around the bars hard enough to whiten the knuckles. "Margaret, there's more." Sheriff Pratt telegraphed the Army Archives requesting the original investigation file from Webb's death. "Should arrive before the trial starts." She reached through the bars and took both his hands in hers, her grip fierce, despite how small it looked swallowed inside his. "We're going to prove this, Caleb. We're going to clear your name, or we're going to hand them enough rope to hang us both trying. Don't talk like that. We have witnesses. We have documentation. The truth is sitting on our side of this table for the first time in 8 years." He wanted to believe her with the same uncomplicated certainty she seemed to carry. He'd seen too much corruption dressed up as procedure, too much cruelty wearing the uniform of duty to trust the system the way she did. But looking at her determined face through iron bars, he found himself nodding anyway, something in his chest loosening just slightly. "All right, we fight." That night, alone with the last sheet of paper Pratt had given him, Caleb wrote a different kind of letter entirely. Not to a judge or the army or anyone wearing official authority. This one was for Margaret, folded small enough to hide inside a boot, written in case the next 3 weeks ended somewhere other than where he hoped. "My dear Margaret," he wrote, "if you're reading this, the trial went against me. I want you to know these last weeks have been the happiest I've carried since before I lost everything the first time. You gave me back something I'd buried in these mountains, along with my wife and daughter. You taught me a man could love again without it costing him the memory of who came before. The cabin is yours regardless of what happens to me. Build your life inside it. Fill it with whatever joy you can find. Don't grieve me longer than your heart can spare. I've already had more than I had any right asking for. A second chance, a glimpse of something close to happiness, the privilege of knowing you at all. That's enough. That's more than enough for one man's share. Live well, live fully, and know that wherever I end up after this, I'll be watching over you with nothing but gratitude. Caleb." He folded it and handed it to Pratt the next morning with instructions to deliver it only if the verdict went against him. "Hope I never have to hand this over," Pratt said, tucking it into his desk drawer. "Hope's a strange animal," Caleb replied. "Wasn't sure I still had any left until about 3 weeks ago." The days counted down. Margaret continued building her case with a relentlessness that surprised even Henrietta Voss. Gathering statements, cross-checking dates, walking the muddy length of Stone Hollow's street so many times the townsfolk started recognizing her by her stride alone. She tracked down a former supply clerk who confirmed the discrepancies Caleb had described. A man who'd been too frightened of Webb's reputation to speak up 8 years earlier, but who, with Webb long dead and his brother's threats carrying less weight inside a courtroom than outside one, finally agreed to put his memory on record. On the 10th evening, sitting across from Father Crane's small fire after another long day of gathering testimony, Margaret allowed herself, for the first time, to speak the fear she'd been carrying silent since the riders first appeared. "What if it isn't enough?" she asked. "What if all of this, every witness, every record, isn't enough to outweigh a dead colonel's name and a brother who spent 8 years sharpening his hatred into something specific?" Crane considered the question with the unhurried patience of a man who had buried more parishioners than he could properly count. "Then it won't be for lack of trying, my dear. And I've found in 81 years that trying counts for something even when the outcome disappoints us. But I don't believe it will disappoint you. Truth has a particular weight to it, heavier than people expect once it's finally allowed into a room." She visited Caleb each evening that Pratt's patience allowed, and on the 15th night, with the trial now only 6 days distant, she found him unusually quiet, his enormous hands wrapped around the bars rather than around hers. "Something's wrong," she said, Nathaniel Webb came by today. While you were out at Granger's, her stomach dropped. What did he want? To remind me he hasn't forgotten anything. To tell me that even if the judge finds me innocent of Victor's death, he intends to make certain I never draw an easy breath in this territory again. Said something about how a man can survive a hanging and still spend the rest of his days wishing he hadn't. That's a threat. That's a promise, Caleb said. And I believe him. Men like Nathaniel don't need a courtroom's permission to ruin somebody. They've got money enough to do it without one. Margaret felt something harden in her chest, some last reservoir of fear converting itself, finally, into something closer to resolve. Then we'll deal with that after. One battle at a time. He doesn't get to win this one just by frightening us before it's even started. Caleb studied her face through the bars for a long moment, something close to wonder moving behind his exhaustion. I don't know what I did to deserve you walking into my life the way you did. You didn't do anything, she said softly. That's rather the point of grace, I think. It doesn't arrive because we've earned it. It arrives because somebody decided to be kind in a blizzard, and everything after that was simply consequence. He reached through the bars and she let him, his enormous hand swallowing hers entirely, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because some things didn't need the added weight of language to be understood between two people who had already survived worse than silence. Judge Marcus Hale arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after Caleb's arrest, a lean man past 60 with silver hair and the particular sharp eyes of someone who'd spent decades sorting truth from convenient fiction. Word of the trial spread through 3 surrounding settlements fast enough that by the morning proceedings were set to begin, Stone Hollow's town hall couldn't have held another body if it tried. Margaret dressed carefully that morning in a dark blue dress that had once been Edward's favorite, the irony of wearing a dead husband's preference into a courtroom, fighting for a different man's life not lost on her, though she had no time left to examine what it meant. She arrived early enough to claim a seat near the front, her portfolio organized into careful sections, statements from townspeople, Father Crane's testimony, letters from Lang and Briggs, the supply clerk's signed account, Caleb's own detailed accounting written in his cramped, careful hand. Caleb was brought in shackled, flanked by Pratt and a deputy, wearing clothes Margaret had brought him, and a beard trimmed close enough that he looked more like the soldier he'd once been than the mountain hermit he'd spent 8 years becoming. When his eyes found hers across the crowded room, she saw fear there, plain and unguarded, and beneath it something that looked almost like gratitude that he wasn't facing this alone. Near the back of the room, arms crossed, an expression composed into something almost pleasant. Nathaniel Webb had claimed a seat, with a clear line of sight to the defendant's chair, and Margaret understood, watching him settle in with the patience of a man who had waited 8 years for precisely this morning, that whatever the verdict, the fight wasn't going to end the moment Judge Hale's gavel came down. The room fell into an expectant hush as Hale took his position behind the makeshift bench, and somewhere underneath the silence, Margaret could feel the whole weight of the next several days pressing down, the truth she had spent 3 weeks gathering now, about to be tested against everything Nathaniel Webb's money and patience had spent the same 3 weeks arranging against it. This is fundamentally a military matter, Judge Hale began, his voice carrying easily to the room's farthest corners. Captain Caleb Strode stands accused of desertion and the murder of a superior officer, Colonel Victor Webb. These are capital offenses under military code. However, since Captain Strode was apprehended by civilian authority, and this court holds jurisdiction over crimes committed within the territory, we proceed under territorial law with appropriate military consultation. He looked directly at Caleb. Captain Strode. Caleb stood, the shackles rattling against the silence. Not guilty, Your Honor. I killed Colonel Webb in self-defense after uncovering his criminal activity. A murmur swept the room. Hale's gavel cracked once. Order. Prosecution, present your case. The territorial prosecutor, a sharp young man named Whitmore who'd traveled with the judge's circuit, laid out the charges with clinical precision. Strode had abandoned his post. He had killed a superior officer. He had evaded justice for 8 years. These facts, Whitmore argued, weren't in dispute. Captain Strode admits to the killing, Whitmore said. The only question before this court is whether justification existed. The burden rests with the defense to prove it. Hale nodded. Defense, Margaret rose. her heart hammering hard enough that she felt certain the whole room could hear it. She had no legal training, no experience standing before a judge. But Pratt had helped her organize the case, and Father Crane had coached her through the mechanics of presenting testimony, and she was, in this moment, the only thing standing between Caleb and a noose, Your Honor. She began, her voice steadier than she felt underneath it. The defense will show that Colonel Victor Webb engaged in criminal activity, namely the theft and illegal sale of army weapons to hostile parties. We will show that Captain Strode discovered this activity, attempted to report it through every proper channel, and was ignored. We will show that when he confronted Webb directly, Webb drew his weapon first with intent to kill, leaving Captain Strode no choice but to defend himself. And we will show that his subsequent flight wasn't cowardice, but a reasonable response to a system that would never have given him a fair hearing, compounded by a grief so fresh it had stripped him of any steadier course of action. Bore claims, Mrs. Donovan Hale said. Can you support them? Yes, Your Honor. Sworn testimonies, military records, multiple witnesses prepared to speak under oath. Hale leaned back, considering. Then let's hear them. Margaret called Otis Granger first, who testified to Caleb's reputation for honesty and the obvious devotion he'd shown his lost family. 3 more townspeople followed, each painting a consistent picture of a decent man wronged by circumstance. The former supply clerk took the stand next, his voice trembling at first, then steadying as he described the inventory discrepancies he'd noticed years earlier and never reported out of fear. A fear he openly admitted now belonged to him alone, and not to the truth of what he'd witnessed. Then came Father Crane, walking to the witness chair with the aid of a cane but speaking with the clarity of decades spent in service to truth rather than convenience. Captain Strode was among the finest officers I encountered in 40 years as an army chaplain, Crane testified, his voice carrying despite his age. He was fair, compassionate, deeply protective of the men under his command. Colonel Webb, by contrast, was cruel and corrupt in ways that were whispered about constantly and proven almost never, because men with his connections rarely face proof. Why not? Hale asked. Because Colonel Webb's uncle sat in the Senate, and his brother-in-law wore a general's stars. Men protected by that kind of family rarely answer for anything regardless of what they've done. And I would add, Your Honor, that Captain Strode confronted him within 4 months of burying his wife and daughter. A man in that condition does not reason the way a steady man reasons. He acts because waiting has already cost him everything once, and he cannot bear the thought of waiting costing him anything further. Whitmore cross-examined aggressively, attempting to paint Crane as a bit old man nursing a decades-old grudge, but the chaplain remained entirely unshaken. I carry no personal grudge, sir, Crane said evenly. I carry only the truth as I witnessed it firsthand. And the truth is that Victor Webb was a disgrace to the uniform he wore every single day he wore it. Testimony continued through the morning. Margaret presented the military records Pratt had managed to secure, supply manifests riddled with discrepancies nobody had ever properly explained, weapons inventories that simply didn't match distribution records, written complaints from other officers about Webb's conduct that had vanished into bureaucratic silence. Then came Corporal Ezra Lang and Private Owen Briggs, both now working as ranch hands but still carrying themselves with the particular bearing of men who'd once worn a uniform. Lang testified first, his voice rough with the discomfort of public speaking but steady underneath it. Captain Strode was the best officer I ever served under, Lang said. Took care of his men. Never asked us to do anything he wouldn't do himself first. When supplies started disappearing, when army rifles started turning up in raids against our own people, Captain Strode investigated personal, kept detailed records, tried reporting it the right way every single time. And what happened when he reported it, Margaret asked. Nothing. Reports vanished. Webb had friends in places high enough that the whole system just looked the other direction. Lang's jaw tightened. The day Webb died, I was on patrol near the supply warehouse, heard the argument start. Heard Webb threaten to see the captain hanged before he'd let his reputation take the hit. Then I heard the shot. Did you witness the shooting itself? No, ma'am. But I reached the warehouse seconds after, saw Webb on the ground, saw the captain standing there holding his pistol, looking like a man whose whole world had just ended in a single breath. And I saw Webb's own pistol on the ground beside him, already fired. Whitmore shot to his feet. Objection. The witness is speculating about the state of the weapon. Sustained, Hale said. Stick to direct observation, Corporal. I saw 2 pistols, Lang said carefully. Both of them fired, both men armed and ready. That's not murder, Your Honor. That's a gunfight between 2 men, and only one of them walked away. Briggs corroborated everything Lang had said, adding further detail about Webb's cruelty toward enlisted men and the climate of fear he'd cultivated throughout the fort. He also testified, unprompted, that the captain's bearing in the months before the shooting had changed entirely, after the news of his family's deaths reached camp, that he'd grown distant, careless of his own safety in a way none of them had known how to address at the time. He wasn't the same man after that telegram came in, Briggs said. None of us knew how to help him carry it. We just watched him get quieter and quieter until the day he confronted the colonel outright. By early afternoon, Hale called a recess, and Margaret found Caleb in a small holding room adjacent to the courtroom, still shackled but allowed to sit. You're doing better than any lawyer I could have hired, he told her. It isn't finished. Whitmore hasn't presented his case yet. He doesn't need much of one. I confess to the killing outright. Context is the only thing left to argue. The judge is listening, Caleb. Really listening. She sat beside him as close as the chains allowed. When you testify, I want you to tell them about the cabin too. About who you've become these last few weeks. They need to see all of you, not just the worst 3 seconds of your life from 8 years ago. When proceedings resumed, Whitmore called his own witnesses, fewer in number but sharper in their intended impact. Webb's widow took the stand first, her composure brittle, her grief, Margaret noted, genuine enough even if the man she was grieving had earned none of it. She described her husband's death in terms that painted him as a devoted family man wronged beyond comprehension, her voice catching at intervals that seemed rehearsed and yet not entirely false. Under Margaret's cross-examination, the widow's testimony began to fracture in ways neither woman had anticipated. Mrs. Webb, Margaret said gently, did your husband discuss his military duties with you? Rarely. He kept that part of his life separate. Did you know he was under suspicion of selling government weapons? The widow hesitated, her composure slipping for the first time. I knew there were rumors. I never believed them. A wife doesn't always know everything her husband carries. Did you know he had threatened other men before, men who questioned his conduct? Objection, Whitmore called. Speculation. I'll allow the question, Hale said, but the witness may decline if she has no direct knowledge. The widow's hands twisted together in her lap. There was a sergeant once, years before. He came to our home, frightened, asking Victor to leave him be about something. I never learned what. Victor told him to get off our property and never come back. She looked up, something close to fear surfacing in her eyes for reasons that had nothing to do with the trial's outcome, and everything to do with a marriage Margaret suspected had held more darkness than the woman had ever permitted herself to examine. I didn't ask questions I didn't want answered, Your Honor. I think most wives in my position wouldn't have. The admission landed heavier in the room than anything Whitmore had intended to elicit, and Margaret saw several jurors exchange glances that suggested the widow's reluctant honesty had done more damage to the prosecution's case than any aggressive cross-examination could have managed. A major from the fort testified next that Strode had abandoned his post without authorization, full stop, his account rigid with the kind of procedural certainty that left no room for context. An Army investigator confirmed Strode's official status as deserter and fugitive, reading from a file that listed facts without once acknowledging the 4 months of grief that had preceded them. But under Margaret's cross-examination, cracks began showing in each account. The major acknowledged complaints had indeed been filed against Webb's conduct, though he claimed he couldn't recall specific details under oath. The investigator conceded the original inquiry into Webb's death had been completed in just 3 days, hardly the thorough examination a capital matter deserved, and admitted further, when pressed, that no one from that original inquiry had ever interviewed Corporal Lang or Private Briggs, despite both men being stationed at the fort during the relevant period. Why weren't they interviewed? Margaret asked. The investigator shifted in his seat. The inquiry concluded quickly. There wasn't pressure to extend it. Wasn't pressure, Margaret repeated, or wasn't permission. Objection, Whitmore called again. The witness already answered. He answered the question I asked him, Hale said, mild. Not the one you wish I'd allow, Mr. Whitmore. Proceed, Mrs. Donovan. Then Margaret called Caleb to the stand. He walked forward with whatever dignity the shackles allowed, took the oath, and settled into the chair facing the judge and the packed room beyond him. Margaret approached gently, aware that every eye in the building had fixed on the enormous weathered man now sitting in judgment's direct path, Captain Strode. "Tell the court what happened the day Colonel Webb died." Caleb's voice stayed steady as he recounted the discrepancies he'd found in the weapons inventory. Weeks of careful investigation, the evidence painstakingly gathered, the decision to confront Webb directly only after official channels had failed him completely. Then his voice changed, dropping into something rawer, more exposed than anything he'd offered the court so far. "I need the court to understand something first," he said, "before I tell you what happened in that warehouse. 4 months before that day, I buried my wife and my 5-year-old daughter. They froze to death 2 miles short of help because nobody stopped to check on a broken-down wagon. I went back to my post 11 days after the funeral because the army doesn't grant a man time to grieve proper. I was not the same officer I'd been before that telegram arrived. I want this court to know that, because I think it explains some of what I did next, even if it doesn't excuse it entirely." The room had gone utterly silent. "I went to the warehouse where Webb conducted his transactions," Caleb continued. "Told him I had proof. Told him I was taking it straight to the territorial governor since the army wouldn't act on it through proper channels. A steadier man might have waited, gathered more witnesses first, gone in with backup instead of walking in alone like a man who'd already decided dying wasn't the worst thing left that could happen to him. But I wasn't steady. I was 4 months into the worst grief of my life, and some part of me had stopped caring whether I walked back out of that warehouse breathing. What did Webb say to you?" He laughed in my face. "Said no one would ever believe a grieving widower over a decorated colonel. Said maybe my family froze because God was punishing me for being a weak soldier." His enormous hands clenched visibly. "That's when he drew on me. What happened next? I drew faster, shot him through the chest. He was dead within minutes." His voice had gone flat, reciting facts rather than reliving them. "I could have stayed, could have tried explaining myself to whoever found us. But I understood exactly how it would read, an enlisted man dead, a captain standing over him holding a smoking pistol, no witnesses except me, so I ran, been running ever since, until 3 weeks back. Until you met Mrs. Donovan," the judge interjected, not unkindly. "Until I met Mrs. Donovan," Caleb agreed. "She gave me bread when I had nothing to offer her. In return, I built her a cabin because it was the only language of gratitude I had left after 8 years of forgetting most others. And somewhere in those weeks, Your Honor, I started wanting to live again instead of simply existing inside my own punishment." Margaret turned to face Hale directly. "Your Honor, I'd like to testify now regarding who Captain Strode has become in the years since that warehouse." Hale nodded. "Proceed." Margaret took the stand and told the whole story without flinching. The blizzard, the broken wagon, the certainty she'd carried that morning that death had finally come to collect what it was owed. Caleb's appearance out of the storm itself, the cabin he'd built with hands the size of dinner plates, the patience he'd shown teaching her to notch logs and red grain, the shared grief that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, become shared hope instead. "He saved my life," she said, her voice ringing clear through the packed hall. "Not only by giving me shelter that night, but by giving me a reason worth staying alive for afterward. He built me a home when walking away would have cost him nothing. He stayed when running would have been easier. He chose to face his past today instead of hiding from it 1 more year in those mountains. That isn't the action of a murderer, Your Honor. That's the action of a man who spent 8 years trying to atone for something a steadier version of himself might never have done in the first place, and who deserves the chance to finish becoming whoever he is now, instead of who his grief made him for 1 single afternoon." Whitmore cross-examined her hard, attempting to paint her testimony as hopelessly compromised by sentiment. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Donovan, that you've developed romantic feelings for the accused?" "Yes," Margaret said without a flicker of hesitation. "I love him. But that doesn't make a single word I've told this court less true. The cabin exists. The kindness exists. The man you're trying to send to the gallows is the same man who took a half-frozen widow and gave her back a reason to live. You can verify every word of it yourselves." Hale called for recess to consider the full weight of testimony presented, and the waiting that followed felt endless, agonizing, A held breath stretched across 2 full hours while Margaret sat beside Caleb's holding cell, their hands clasped through the bars, neither one finding words adequate to the silence between them. When Hale finally returned, the room fell into a hush so complete that the creak of his chair settling seemed to echo off every wall. "I've reviewed the testimony and evidence presented by both parties," he began. "This is a complicated matter involving events 8 years distant, limited physical evidence, and conflicting accounts that time has done nothing to simplify. Certain facts, however, have emerged with clarity. Colonel Victor Webb engaged in documented criminal activity. Multiple witnesses have testified to this independently, and the recovered military records corroborate it. Captain Strode attempted to report that activity through every available official channel and was systematically ignored. When he finally confronted Webb directly, Webb drew his weapon first. He paused, looking directly at Caleb. We have only Captain Strode's account of that final detail, but it is corroborated by Corporal Lang's testimony regarding the position of both weapons at the scene. Hale lifted his gavel slightly, not yet bringing it down. I will also note, for the record, that this court takes seriously the testimony regarding Captain Strode's state of mind in the months preceding the shooting. A man who has buried his entire family within the same season cannot reasonably be expected to act with the same deliberation as a man in full possession of his composure. This does not excuse the act of desertion that followed. It does, however, weigh heavily against any suggestion that the killing itself was premeditated rather than a desperate response from a man with nothing left to lose and everything left to grieve. The gavel came down. On the charge of murder, I find the defendant not guilty. The killing constituted justified self-defense. On the charge of desertion, I find sufficient extenuating circumstance to warrant leniency. Sentence is time already served, 8 years as a fugitive, plus 5 years probation, during which Captain Strode must report quarterly to territorial authorities and may not leave this territory without express permission. He looked directly at Caleb one final time. You're free to go, Captain, but you are not free to run from anything ever again. The room erupted. Margaret was on her feet before the gavel's echo had finished, pushing through bodies toward the holding room where deputies were already working the shackles loose from Caleb's enormous wrists. You did it, he said, his voice rough with something that wasn't quite belief yet. We did it, she corrected, throwing herself against his chest hard enough that he had to brace himself to catch her properly, his arms coming around her with the careful strength of a man who had spent years learning exactly how much pressure he could safely apply to something precious. Pratt appeared in the doorway, something close to a smile cracking his weathered face. Congratulations, Strode. Looks like you're a free man, not entirely free. 5 years probation, hell of a lot better than a rope, Pratt said, extending his hand. For what it's worth, I'm glad this turned out the way it did. You're a good man who got caught in circumstances no good man should have had to survive. Across the emptying hall, Margaret caught sight of Nathaniel Webb pushing his way toward the door, his face gone rigid with a fury that had nowhere left to land. 8 years of waiting collapsing into nothing in the space of a single afternoon's testimony. Near the door he paused, just long enough to fix Caleb with a look that promised the threat from weeks earlier hadn't dissolved simply because a judge had ruled against him. This isn't finished, Nathaniel said, low enough that only those nearest the door caught it. You may have bought yourself a verdict, Strode. You haven't bought yourself peace. Pratt stepped between them before Caleb could answer, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a lawman done indulging a sore loser. You heard the judge, Webb. Man's free and clear under the law. You'd do well to remember threatening him in a room full of witnesses isn't the wisest use of your remaining credit in this territory. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further, simply turned and disappeared into the dispersing crowd, and Margaret felt the cold weight of his promise settle somewhere at the base of her spine, even as the rest of the room continued celebrating around her. He'll try something, she said quietly. Once the holding room had emptied enough to speak freely, maybe, Caleb admitted. But he's a man with money and grudges, Margaret. Not law on his side anymore. Pratt heard him plain just now, and so did half this town. If he comes at us again, he comes at us with witnesses already lined up against him before he's even started. She wanted that reassurance to settle the fear entirely. It didn't, not completely, but she let herself believe it enough to breathe easier than she had in 3 weeks. They remained in Stone Hollow 2 more days, tying off loose ends, Caleb reporting to the territorial clerk to establish his probationary status, Margaret purchasing supplies for the journey home, more this time than they'd carried in, now that there was a future stretched out ahead worth properly provisioning for. Father Crane visited them at Henrietta's boarding house the evening before they left, his cane tapping a slow rhythm against the floorboards as he settled into the chair Margaret offered him. "I'd like to perform the ceremony," he said, without preamble, "when the two of you are ready for one. No charge, naturally. Consider it my contribution to a story I've waited a long while to see end better than most of them do." Caleb's enormous hand found Margaret's without either of them deciding the gesture consciously. "We haven't discussed that yet, Father." "Then I'll leave you to discuss it," Crane said, already rising with the help of his cane. "But don't wait too long. A man my age has a limited number of ceremonies left in him, and I'd rather spend one of them on something worth the walk out to your valley." On the third morning, they loaded a wagon Caleb had purchased outright from Granger and began the long ride back through the mountains. Spring was arriving early, snow melting into patches that revealed dark earth and the first stubborn green shoots pushing through it, the air carrying the mingled scent of pine and mud and something that smelled unmistakably like possibility. When they finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood waiting, Caleb stopped the wagon and simply looked, as though he'd half expected the whole structure to have vanished in their absence. "It's still here," he said. "Of course it is," Margaret said. "You built it to last." She climbed down and crossed to the door, running her palm along the wood the way she might check on a sleeping child, and understood with sudden complete certainty that whatever came next, this clearing, this cabin, this enormous careful man beside her, had become the only home she still needed. They spent the following weeks finishing what the trial had interrupted. Caleb built shelving along the cabin's interior walls, a proper table from salvaged wagon timber, a second chair to match the first he'd carved during those early evenings by the fire. Margaret hung curtains sewn from fabric purchased in Stone Hollow, planted the first seeds of a garden in soil still cold enough to bite at her fingers, and found, more than once, that she had stopped reaching for Edward's watch the way she once had, not because she'd forgotten him, but because the ache had finally settled into something she could carry alongside happiness rather than instead of it. On a clear morning in late spring, with wildflowers pushing up through the meadow grass and the last of the mountain snow retreating to the highest peaks, Father Crane made the journey out to the valley exactly as he'd promised. Accompanied by Sheriff Pratt, by Otis Granger and his wife, by Henrietta Voss carrying a cake she'd insisted on baking despite the difficulty of the road. The ceremony itself was simple. Conducted in front of the cabin with the mountains standing witness the way they'd stood witness to everything else that had happened in this clearing. And when Crane pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed her with the same careful gentleness he'd shown that very first night. As though some part of him still couldn't quite believe his hands were allowed to hold something this precious without breaking it. The small gathering stayed through the afternoon, sharing food and stories beneath a sky finally warm enough to sit under without a coat, and when the last of the guests had ridden back down the mountain trail and the cabin stood quiet again, in the gathering dusk, Caleb and Margaret remained on the porch he'd built specifically for evenings like this one, watching the light change color across the peaks. "I have something for you," Caleb said eventually, disappearing inside and returning with a carved wooden sign, the letters rendered with the same careful precision he brought to everything his hands touched. Strode and Donovan, it read, though Margaret noted immediately that her own name had been carved beside his rather than replaced by it, for above the door, he explained. "So anybody passing through knows exactly whose home this is." She traced the letters with her finger, throat tight with something too full to easily name. "It's perfect." He hung it that evening, and they stood back together to admire it, this cabin that had begun as a stranger's act of gratitude and had become, somewhere in the months since, the truest home either of them had built in years. Summer arrived slowly, the valley filling with the sound of running water and bird song, the garden Margaret had planted finally pushing up through soil gone soft and warm. On a morning in early August, she woke before Caleb did, lay still for a moment listening to his even breathing beside her. and understood with a certainty that had nothing to do with calculation and everything to do with instinct exactly what the past several weeks of fatigue and quiet nausea had actually meant. "Caleb," she said softly, once he'd stirred. He turned toward her, immediately alert in the way he always was, some old soldier's instinct that had never fully left him even in sleep. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." She took his hand, pressed it gently against her own stomach, watched the understanding move slowly across his face. "I think we're going to need a bigger table than the one you built." For a long moment he said nothing at all, his enormous frame gone perfectly still. And when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, rough with an emotion neither of them had words large enough to properly contain. A baby, she confirmed. He pulled her against his chest with a careful, trembling gentleness, his face pressed into her hair, and she felt something shake through his entire enormous frame that she understood, without needing to ask. Was 8 years of grief finally making room for something it had never expected to hold again? "Thank you," he whispered, the words barely audible. "Thank you for this." For all of it, they sat together as the morning light strengthened across the valley, the cabin standing solid behind them, the garden growing green in front of them, and somewhere beyond the ridge the mountains kept their patient watch the way they always had, indifferent to human grief and human joy alike, but having witnessed this particular season considerably more of the latter than anyone standing in that clearing 8 months earlier would ever have thought possible. Caleb looked up at the carved sign above their door, Strode and Donovan, and thought of all the ways a single act of kindness in a blizzard had unfolded into everything sitting in front of him now: a wife, a home, a child not yet born, but already changing the shape of every future he allowed himself to imagine. The cabin had been built as a debt repaid. It had become, somewhere along the way, something far larger than either of them had set out to make, proof that a man could lose everything once and still, against every reasonable expectation, be given the chance to build something worth keeping all over again.